Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our COVID-19 Town Hall Unanswered Questions live stream. My name is Holly Foxworth. I'm a registered nurse here at Axiom Medical, and I'm also joined by Axiom's president and CEO, Mark Robinson. Welcome to the live stream. Mark, would you like to give us a quick hello?
Hello, everybody. This is a follow-up from last week's webinar, which I'm sure Holly will talk about in a moment, and I'm really happy to be here to answer questions.
Great. Well, Mark, we had some great feedback from this last Thursday's webinar on restoring consumer and employee confidence. You had some excellent recommendations, which I saw firsthand being utilized when I ventured out for the first time this last weekend for some household items. I observed some of the capacity control with the monitoring and the number of consumers allowed in businesses, some of the one-directional pathways there, and some of the social distancing with the lines drawn for place markers, while we were waiting to check out and pay for some of those purchased goods. While such measures definitely increased my confidence as a consumer, I immediately was taken back a little bit by the vast number of people who maybe were not utilizing some of the facial coverings, at least here in Texas, by both employees and consumers. So it feels like that we may still have a little bit of work to do as a nation in terms of consistent practices and really incorporating some of those best practice standards so that we're not only restoring confidence, but we're also really being as safe as possible. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, I certainly would. Look, I think that a lot of people have grown to be resentful of the restrictions and changes to their way of life, and have misinterpreted states opening up or relaxing some of the restrictions as license to go back to life as it was before. And we simply aren't there yet. The good work that has been done over the course of the last several weeks through strong social distancing and everybody being aware of and cautious about the risk of becoming infected is at risk of being undone if people don't sustain those behaviors, at least for the time being. The virus has not gone away. We have actually done nothing except suppress the number of people carrying it through lack of contact. And if people begin to be in regular contact with one another again and don't observe social distancing, the strong likelihood is a resurgence in the number of infections and ultimately the number of hospitalizations and deaths.
Absolutely, I completely agree. So clearly, we still have some education there that can be done on the public front. I really appreciate you taking the time there to share your knowledge and expertise, especially as we're working to move forward with businesses reopening there. Before we get into some of these follow-up questions, I did want to mention that many of you have asked, how can I specifically have my COVID-19 questions answered by the experts? And so we actually have made that process very easy and accessible to everybody. If you'll simply email those questions to coronavirus@axiomllc.com, I can promise you that we will get you the answers that you need. So whether that's from health to HR to what to expect in the future, whatever it is, we're here to help in any way that we can. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Well, Mark, we're going to go ahead and jump into the questions then. We did have a variety that were submitted this week. We'll start with the topic of protection first. John has asked specifically about a subject we've seen in the media headlines a lot this last week. He says, we're hearing reports of the eyes being susceptible to COVID-19. Should we consider use of goggles or a face shield?
That's a big yes, no, maybe. Ambiguous. Look, the eyes are basically a vector through which the disease can enter your body. Your eyes connect to your ears, they connect to your throat. When you breathe in and out, the little tubes that connect everything inside your head pressurize and depressurize. And typically, though, infection with COVID through the eyes, as far as we know, occurs when an infected surface, typically the hands or fingers or the backs of the hands, is used in contact with the eyes. Many of us touch our eyes many times a day, subconsciously, with absolutely no awareness of doing so. As someone who wears eyeglasses, I probably touch mine very much less and more consciously, because I have to slip my eyeglasses aside to scratch in the corner of my eye or whatever it is. So it's that contact from a surface carrying an infection, like a finger, to the eye, to the tear duct specifically, more relevantly, that transfers the infection. However, if you are face to face with somebody, close to somebody, and you're performing a service that needs that level of proximity, a beautician may be an example, or certainly anybody in the medical sphere, a dentist, anybody who has to be face to face with you real close, especially if you're talking or if they're breathing heavily or under any kind of stress and huffing breaths out, then your eyes can be a way to get infected just from those fomites that are expressed, traveling and connecting to your eyeballs or to your tear ducts. So if you have employees or if you yourself are engaged in those kinds of activities, then a face shield or goggles, goggles may be more readily available to you because, you know, swimming goggles are easy to get, or a face shield if you need full range of vision, would certainly be a good idea. We're not recommending face shields and goggles for most people in most circumstances at this point. If you're just co-workers and you maintain your 6 feet of separation, and you know nobody's breathing in the other person's face, then you probably don't need the face shield. Make your own judgment call, though. That's all I would say.
Okay. And then Mike says, in the webinar, you mentioned waivers for places like auto dealerships. Can you explain what type of waiver this would be, and what would you recommend waivers for other types of businesses?
So I mentioned waivers as one way to, A, draw attention to people of the risks that they're choosing to take, and B, to limit your liability in case any of those risks are realized. I am not a lawyer. I haven't even stayed in a Holiday Inn Express for quite some time, and I'm not qualified to give legal advice in this regard. But my suggestion to consider it was basically in the circumstances of a potential purchaser of a car needing to have a test drive with the employee of the dealership being in the car with them. And the risk is the employee infects the customer, or the customer infects the employee, because the closed proximity of a car, especially no windows open or not a soft top, that closed proximity for the longer than 10 or 15 minutes that the average test drive usually lasts poses a specific exposure risk. And you know, if the customer is willingly and in full knowledge of the risk getting in that car for the test drive, then you might want to actually look at, for example, a waiver or some other legal distancing tool to remove you from liability. That said, take your own legal advice on this. As I said, I'm absolutely not a lawyer. There are obviously other circumstances. Again, we talked about beauticians, hairstylists, manicurists and pedicurists, people whose role, the job they're performing for you, puts them in close physical proximity with you for an extended period of time. Waivers may be something that you might want to start incorporating into standard business practice. Again, legal advice, please, and don't take my advice on that.
Okay. Well, shifting gears and kind of focusing on the future, Jennifer asked a great question. She says, as flu season approaches, will we need to change our screening procedures to differentiate between COVID-19 and the flu?
Yes, kinda. Our screening procedures already draw that differentiation. They're designed to isolate those symptoms which are specific to COVID-19. And therefore, when we get to flu season, we will naturally be able to distinguish between the probability of COVID versus the probability of the flu. However, most of the people I talk to, most of my friends and associates in the business world are looking at the influenza season this year and they're saying, hey, do we really want to have people who are infectious with influenza in the office any more than we want to have people who are infectious with COVID-19 or strep throat for that matter, or other communicable diseases? If you catch the flu and then you catch COVID, you're more vulnerable to COVID. If you catch COVID and then catch the flu, you're more vulnerable to the flu. And in both cases, you're at risk of transmitting that illness to other people in your office, and at the very least causing them, a week or two of unpleasantness and suffering while they recover, and the lost time and productivity for everybody you infected that results in. So my office will certainly be not wanting people with the flu or strep throat coming in. It makes a difference as to what you do after you diagnose them. So, for example, with the influenza, you're not going to need them to go get a test. You're not going to need them to take 14 days of isolation from an exposure, etc. But you are going to want to try and manage those folks to stay out of the office whilst infectious.
Great. And then Patty spoke to a statement made by the World Health Organization this last week, who indicated that we may never completely eradicate COVID-19. So therefore, she's asking whether we'll need to continue the same safety measures moving forward.
So that's really hard to say definitively. Eradicate is one of those very big words that can rarely be fully applied to a disease. We can remove a disease from an area or a region through a whole variety of techniques, including quarantines, exclusions, lockdowns, until all the current sufferers of the disease have recovered, at which point, if there's nobody transmitting, there's no disease. Unfortunately, the modern world is very interconnected. Travelers come from everywhere to everywhere every day. And so if an outbreak occurs anywhere, it's likely to spread around the world fairly quickly. The other side to this is more about what we don't know or don't have yet. So we don't really know whether, having had the disease, immunity is conferred upon the person that has it or has had it. We know that some people generate antibodies, some people don't appear to generate antibodies or very, very few antibodies. So and we don't know how long the body will continue to manufacture those, and we don't know how the COVID-19 virus mutates. We don't know how quickly it drifts away from its current version to a new version that's sufficiently different to reinfect people who already had it. So all of those are big unknowns, and there are tens of thousands of researchers all around the world scrambling to figure this out. In addition, we do not yet have a vaccine. There are some candidate vaccines in progress. When you have a good candidate, it's still typically 18 to 24 months before a vaccine is approved for general use. And it can, even if it were approved more quickly, it can take a long time to ramp up production of that vaccine to make it universally available. And not all vaccines are as effective as other vaccines. Some confer limited immunity or simply reduce the severity of the disease. So we don't know how long it will be before we have an active vaccine. Some diseases we never find a vaccine for. AIDS is a great example. We have no viable vaccination for AIDS or HIV as yet, and that's been around with us for about 40 years at this point. So I'm optimistic. I think there will be a vaccine. There are some very strong candidates in development. I think governments will probably fast track those vaccines. I will look carefully at them as they're brought to market, and at the point where I think one is sufficiently safe to use, which means that the odds of me getting ill or dying from the vaccine are significantly less than the odds of me getting ill or dying from COVID-19, then I will certainly take that vaccine. But I do expect balance of probabilities, that's 12 months out, maybe a bit longer.
So they need to continue with some of the measures, the safety measures.
Absolutely. In the interim, continue with the modifications you've made for your lifestyle, especially if you know you're a vulnerable person or you have a vulnerable person in your household who, were you to catch it and take it home, you might actually give it to them, and that might result in severe illness for them.
Great point. All right, well, moving on to an employment and HR issue. Henry says states like Ohio, Texas, Vermont, and South Carolina are asking employers to report to the State Department of Labor if an employee refuses to come to work without good cause. He is asking whether an employee health issue would fall within that.
Yes, no, maybe. I know that's my favorite answer to many of these things. Look, if the employee has a pre-existing condition that would make them more vulnerable than the average member of the population to the consequences of COVID-19, it would be reasonable for that employee to request an accommodation that allowed them to continue to work from home. And a wise employer would grant that accommodation if the role that the employee had could be accommodated from home. On the other hand, if the employee needs that accommodation, but the role they perform is one you cannot have performed from home, then the probability is that you'll end up separating that employee at one point or another. Simply because I doubt that many employers can afford to carry many non-productive workers for an extended period of time until there's a vaccine available, for example. So I think it's yes, a health issue can fall within that. Again, your HR department should already be used to dealing with requests for accommodations from other conditions, for example, a minor disability or some chronic illness that makes that means that the total number of hours that can be worked are reduced, various things. So your own HR department should be able to help with that determination.
So follow up with HR. Good point.
Follow up with HR.
Okay, on to the subject of masks. This one's our most popular topic that always comes up each week. But this week, Glenn mentioned 3 airlines have told attendants that their role is informational, not enforcement regarding masks. Doesn't not wearing masks on planes but requiring them to board defeat the purpose? Yes,
it does. Look, I personally have no intention of getting on a plane until or unless I'm convinced that I'm reasonably protected from the risk that other passengers on that plane are carrying COVID-19. I happen to be a person who's somewhat vulnerable to the disease. But even if I were a healthy and younger person, I would still be thinking twice or 3 times about it. In my opinion, and were I operating an airline, I would require my passengers to wear the mask for the duration of the flight. And would, if they chose not to do that, there are usually air marshals or other persons on board the plane who can take action if required, or the plane can land early off board the passenger and they can be prosecuted. I don't think generally, and I'm not generally in favor of government controlling the behavior of people in public places, but an airplane is a private place operated for commercial profit by an airline, and they have every right to say, if you don't wear your mask while you're on my plane, you have to get off my plane.
Well, and I just think about, especially when it comes back to the topic that we discussed this last week about confidence, it doesn't give you a lot of confidence to think that you're going to be on a plane and that everybody is not using that mask, especially whenever it was right at the beginning.
Yeah, now that said, I have a lot of sympathy with flight attendants being asked to perform enforcement activities. I think that they're not trained for that. Passengers can become very belligerent when confronted about a non-compliance. And I would be reluctant, were I a flight attendant, to be performing that. Were I an airline, I would probably be putting security personnel on planes. Give up 1 seat on your plane to and publicize the fact that you have enforcement on the plane, and possibly you fill a lot more seats on that plane because passengers have more confidence.
Sure, absolutely. Well, our final question is actually regarding health attestation. And so Leslie asked whether there would be other ways to complete a health attestation other than an app, such as an agent check-in or maybe something by phone.
Yes, absolutely. Our own solution, you can use a website, a web page to do it. You can use apps on Google or Android. You can actually, you almost can. Very shortly, we'll be able to use an IVR phone solution where you call in and it takes you through a series of yes/no questions using a voice prompted menu. And were you to be flagged as requiring additional supervision, additional screening, would then drop you right into the call center to conduct that screening. There's also a text version of it where you can interact by text instead. I think there are many ways to. Oh, and sorry, there's also what we call agent check-in, where you arrive at the perimeter of a workplace and there is an agent who asks you the questions necessary to conduct that initial screening, and enters that information on your behalf into the app. So there are many ways to get there, but the important thing in all cases is that the employee themselves are attesting to the fact that they're healthy. And the further important thing is that your HR policies need to, number one, remove any incentive for them to lie about it by not penalizing them through loss of comp if they do have an infectious disease. And two, you need to make the consequences of lying about it serious, including termination of the employee for doing so. So you create an incentive not to lie, and then you remove the incentive to lie. And attestation should be a very, very reliable means of determining whether the employee is likely to be infected at that point in time.
Well, and the other piece of that too is that I really like the idea of that you're stopping this before they enter your facility.
Yes.
Isn't that a piece of that, and preventing that infection becoming into your location and then spreading from there? So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's this concept called layered security, right? Which anybody who's in the physical security business already understands, where you have layers of defense. And you imagine the Secret Service around the president. They do a site visit ahead of time. They identify all the threat vectors to where the president is going to be situated. They visit with any people in the area who are known to be potential threats because of behavior that's been identified in the past. And they then have a ring of agents around the president. The president's in a bulletproof car when he's not necessarily out of it. If he stands behind a podium, there's a Lexan, a big screen in front of him that prevents him from being shot by some enterprising person. And so that concept is layered security. And that's what we need to be thinking about for the workplace. We need to put up a series of barriers to reduce the probability that somebody who's actively infected gets access to the workplace.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that's going to do it for questions, Mark. Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
No, well, one last thing. This stuff's still all changing fast, okay? Every day there's new information, there's new research, more deeper understanding of COVID-19 itself, but also all 50 states are constantly changing their status in regard to the recommendations that they have in place on public behavior. And yeah, I would be never thinking that we're at a final place on this, but creating a checklist of things to look at every day to make sure that what I'm doing today is the right thing rather than yesterday's news and already out of date.
Good point. Well, Mark, again, I appreciate you joining us today. Just a few quick missions. If you haven't already signed up, we do have another webinar that we're going to be hosting on Thursday at 1 o'clock p.m. Central with our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Scott Cherry, addressing vulnerable employee populations and what it is that you can do to protect them. So we'd love to have you join us. Also, if you're looking for additional information about risk mitigation and some return to work strategies, Chuck Cable, which is Axiom's Chief Legal and HR Officer, has authored an excellent white paper called The World After COVID-19. And so you can access a free copy of that publication on our website. Another quick reminder, don't forget to send us your town hall questions to coronavirus@axiomllc.com. Again, that's coronavirus@axiomllc.com. And finally, should you have any questions regarding the Coronavirus Rapid Response Program or the new Check Into Work app, please reach out. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to talking to you Thursday at the webinar. Stay safe.